Do you ever feel like Stalker is a weird name to have as a class? Why not go with Hunter or even Archer? Naming conventions aside, today's guide will be about the Stalker class. Stalker is a class that I feel like currently is one of the weaker attacking classes due to how it relies heavily on bleed, which is of course a debuff, and even with bleed it still does less damage than most other classes. It's got a couple good tools, but they don't really coordinate as well as you'd want. Unfortunately, this game gives you a lot of good options, so if you really want to use Stalker, there's some decent setups you can use to have plenty of success with. In this video, I want to discuss the Stalker class, talk about its strengths and weaknesses, and showcase how to use it most effectively. As always, if you enjoy these guides, please be sure to subscribe to the channel because it really does help me out so much. Let's get into it. So Noah is the class inheritor and S rank for Stalker. As such, I will be using and showing the class off on him. He has one of the higher attacking stats and a good dexterity stat, making him a pretty decent option for the class. You could also consider running this on Senna, since the class has a very high natural dexterity value and she has the highest attack stat in the game, so her lower dexterity will not matter as much. Regardless, it really doesn't matter too much since base stat differences are pretty minor at best. The first battle skill that this class has is Swift Death. This will deal 70% more damage against enemies who are at 30% health or less. Personally, I never liked these skills that increase damage the lower the health of an enemy, simply because by the time you get to that health range, you're likely to be in a chain attack and you're going to be killing the enemy pretty easily anyway, so I much prefer having abilities that'll deal more damage to the enemy earlier in the fight, but at the very least, 70% more damage isn't really a bad total, and it does make the class a bit more useful when enemies get to that health range, so it's not a terrible skill. In Cold Blood, this will boost damage dealt by 150% when attacking an enemy suffering from bleed. This is kind of what the entire kit is built around, and you really need the enemy to be bleeding if you want to be able to deal any kind of significant damage at all. If an enemy is not bleeding, you're going to be very, very weak, and pretty much every other DPS class except maybe Machine Assassin is going to be more useful than you. Now, fortunately, this class does have a bleed art, and you can also get another bleed art as a master art, and you probably want to run both simply because you really, really need that bleed. But bleed does count as a debuff, and enemies have very high debuff resistance in this game, especially unique monsters, especially on hard mode as well, where debuff resistance is increased further, making this class very, very worthless on higher difficulties, unfortunately. Evasion Expertise will give you a 50% chance to evade ranged attacks. This is an okay skill. It's a bit weird to have on a DPS class, but at the very least, if an enemy is using some kind of area of effect ranged attack, this can be a useful skill to just evade it half the time. But at the very least, you're probably not going to be ever taking aggro, so that's going to make this skill a little bit less useful since you're not going to really have to worry about directly dodging enemy attacks unless it's an area of effect. But it's still an okay skill. It's just a little weird on this class. Serene Heart will reduce aggro generated from all attacks by 50%. Now, this class was probably never going to be getting aggro anyway, simply because the damage total that you have is just incredibly low, and you could easily run the gem effect that would have kind of the same effect, so I think a more useful class skill that would be more unique would probably be more useful here, but at the very least, you can run the plus 70 attack gem instead of this and get as much benefit out of the attacks as possible, so at the very least, it has some use because of that. All in all, your class skills very heavily revolve around the bleed damage, and as such, you want to make sure the enemy is bleeding as much as possible, and as such, I actually recommend running Sappy Drain. This will increase success rate of debuff effects by 25 percentage points. Trust me, you really, really want this skill if you want to make the enemy bleed much. Fortunately, I think bleed is one of the easier debuffs to apply compared to most other debuffs in the game. Maybe it's just because you have a lot more chances at the very least as well. And this helps a lot, especially on normal mode, and if you're playing on easy mode, you can pretty much guarantee bleeds with this at the very least, since that has reduced enemy debuff resistance. Critical Strike is just going to be extremely useful for getting as much critical hit damage as possible, since the class does have a very high natural critical hit rate, which is one of the benefits of the class. Critical damage is, of course, an independent multiplier, and as such, it is definitely something you want to be running. It also pairs very well with Eye for Weak Points, which will boost your critical hit rate by 2% up to 100% for each attack, and it'll be very, very easy to hit this and get to 60% critical hit rate over the course of a long fight, simply because you are going to be doing a lot of attacks with this class, because you're probably not going to be killing that fast overall, sad as that is to say. The arts of this class include Landslide, which will boost damage to launch enemies by 150%, and also grant guaranteed evasion while the art is active on a recharge gauge of 4, and with a pretty decent power multiplier of 390%. Now, this art isn't really that bad at all. It's pretty useful, especially because launch is a pretty good status effect in general, so you can definitely take advantage of this. And having guaranteed evasion art is always going to be useful on basically every single class, just in case you do get aggro, although it's not very likely on this class. You can basically guarantee an evasion to any kind of powerful attack and hopefully keep yourself alive just a little bit longer. Staying Power is a field effect that will grant art follow-up. This has a recharge gauge of 3. Now, art follow-up is a mostly useless effect. However, there is one very funny niche application of it on the final boss, but regardless, most of the time it is going to be a useless effect. Basically, every time you are in a circle and use an art that attacks an enemy, there will be a small extra hit that attacks the enemy that is based on your total attack power. It'll be the same damage every single art you use, regardless of the damage of the actual art itself, and as such, it's basically kind of like a spike damage effect. It's always going to be consistent damage, and it's always going to be kind of useful if you are in any kind of situation where an enemy has a really, really high defense or something like that. But besides that, it's not the most useful effect, and I would probably not recommend running it in most situations. Driving Arrow is basically your required art because it inflicts bleed when you attack the enemy from behind, so you pretty much are required to run this. It only has a 200% power multiplier, but you're not really using it for the power, you just need to inflict bleed. And the recharge gauge is 3, so it's up pretty often, and you get a lot of chances at the very least, so I think it is going to be pretty much mandatory to run this. Rapid Shot has the highest power multiplier in the entire game outside of any non-Soul Hacker art at 520%, 20% higher than one of Sarah's arts, and on a recharge gauge of 5, which is actually pretty quick. It also boosts damage when you attack from the side by 150%. This is your strongest art. Unfortunately, it comes out just a little bit slow, making it not quite as efficient as you might want, but it is a very, very powerful art, and probably going to be the most useful art that you have in a lot of situations. But I do wish it synergized a bit better with the rest of the kit, because a lot of this class seems like it wants to attack from behind, especially its final art, Night Hunt, which boosts back attack damage by 30% and reduces aggro drawn when attacking, which is a stance effect. And you don't really get the benefit of this if you're trying to attack from the side for Rapid Shot. So this doesn't really synergize super well together, and I don't really like this stance art because of that, simply because your best arts are not really going to benefit out of it. But it is an okay stance effect. You're not really going to have to worry about aggro regardless, but if you are getting aggro somehow, then this can be an okay stance to run. Even with Rapid Shot, the total damage of this class is unfortunately still a little bit low though. Refreshing Rain is the talent art for the class. This will deal 100% more damage to enemies who are at 30% health or less. It has a recharge gauge of 3 and a standard power multiplier of 700%. This is kind of one of the less useful talent art effects as well, I find, simply because enemies are not very likely to be less than 30% health when you have this talent art up, unless you're playing on hard mode or purposely not using chain attack, simply because you'll probably be in a chain attack by the time this effect ever actually gets that useful. But at the very least, it's an okay power multiplier and can be worth using just to throw out if you have nothing else available. For my Master Arts, I have Demolition. This has a 50% chance to ignore defense, and it also counts as an Ether attack, so it'll take advantage of all of the other Ether attack bonuses that I have on the kit, and pairs pretty well with Rapid Shot. It has a pretty high power multiplier, 440%. The recharge gauge is a little bit long, but it is a pretty useful Ether attack to have, and I think it is useful because of that. Cross Impact is here for the Power Charge effect. Power Charge is very useful for increasing the damage of your next art a pretty significant amount. Even though it's a physical attack, I do recommend running this, simply because Power Charge is always going to be a really strong and useful effect. Hidden Thorn, despite usually being like one of the more powerful arts, I would not usually recommend running this on an Ether-based class. However, I recommend running it on this class simply because it has the bleed effect, and you really want to make enemies bleed. I've also tied it to Driving Arrow, so you get 2 chances to bleed the enemy if you have these linked together, if you use them at the same time, which can be pretty useful if you're in a chain attack and need to just inflict bleed before the next round of a chain attack so you can get as much damage out of Demolition, Rapid Shot, Team Up as possible. For gem setup, I'm just running the 3 strongest attacker-based gems you can possibly run. Steel Cleaver, which increases attack by a flat total of 70, making Noah reach a total of 1,442. Analyze Weakness will increase critical hit damage bonus by 70 percentage points. Pretty useful at the high critical hit rate of the class, especially the 60% I'll be reaching in combat, to give yourself even more powerful critical hits and allow you to get them more often. And Empowered Combo will boost damage when you cancel by 75%. Now, this doesn't work in chain attacks, but it's still a really nice effect to have to give you a lot more damage outside of chain attacks, and there's not really any other major damage increases on the skill tree. You could run Dispersed Bloodlust if you really want to make sure you absolutely never get aggro at all, but it's really not that necessary. You're probably never going to be taking aggro regardless, simply because the class damage is going to be weak most of the time, unless you can consistently keep bleed up on an enemy. Art cooldowns are also pretty low, so you probably don't have to worry about Steady Strike or Double Strike, but those can be options if you really need more chances to apply bleed as well. For accessories, I am running Saturni Rings. This boosts attack by 40%. Pretty standard on an attacker class, although if you're running another attacker that might have a lot more damage, you may want to run Ceramic Belt instead on this class, since it's probably likely to have less damage overall, and the other attacker might get more benefit out of it. But if you want to have as much damage as possible, definitely run the Saturni Ring. Warped Black Brooch is pretty much going to be a requirement on any ether-based attacker class for ignoring 30% of enemies' ether defense. This is a really significant damage increase because, as mentioned plenty of times, this is a mistranslation slightly. This actually lowers enemy ether defense by 30 percentage points, giving you a pretty big increase to all of your ether damage, which is the majority of this class's damage, and as such, I definitely recommend running it. Silver Braided Belt boosts damage dealt by 80% when attacking an enemy suffering from bleed. Now, you could consider running a more consistent damage boost, but since this class revolves so heavily around bleed anyway, I figure you may as well just run this, because if an enemy is bleeding, you'll get the most benefit out of it, and you pretty much only are going to want to use this class if you can make the enemy bleed. And 80% at all times is going to be pretty useful for the class. You could also consider something like Lune Range, which would give you 100% boost to all of your fusion art damage, and be a bit more consistent than this, and allow you to get a little bit of extra damage in a chain attack with a 20% extra bonus to enemies regardless, since all of your arts and chain attacks are fusion-based. And with all of that setup done, let's take a look at how to use this class practically. So I decided to try my hand at Peril Wing today because I feel like I rarely show off Peril Wing, and that's probably because the visual clarity in these water fights is just absolutely terrible. At the very least, though, I think Peril Wing probably has less debuff resistance than a lot of the other super bosses, so I feel like it's probably one of the better super bosses to try to show off this class against. And I am on normal mode because debuff resistance gets higher with higher difficulty, and otherwise I would not be able to break the enemy at all, or make the enemy bleed at all on hard mode, and I don't really want to do that. So I'm just going to be doing it on normal mode here. Now, ideally I'm just going to be trying to inflict bleed from the back as much as I can. Right now that has not been very successful so far, but I'm doing my best. And when my side attack's up, I am just trying to get some extra damage from the side for a rapid shot. You can see it's not even doing over 100,000 damage without bleed. Bleed is really important for this class. I finally get it inflicted there, and I've got power charge up and rapid shot demolition combo, so I can finally get something good here. So we go for it, and one of the attacks misses, but the other one does 450k damage, so now we can finally get a little bit of decent damage in. Talon Art does some okay damage as well, just as kind of a finisher there. And now I'm going to go behind and try to reapply bleed, because it'll probably wear out pretty soon. Now, one interesting application, and one thing that makes debuff classes not the absolute worst thing in the world, is that you have access to Tyon's Ouroboros, and if you have everything on his tree, this actually will freeze all debuffs. So, as long as this is active, if you have an ally in it, the enemy will never lose the debuffs they currently have, which is honestly a pretty beneficial thing in these kind of fights. Tyon's Ouroboros also has the benefit, I think, of lowering enemy debuff resistance. I don't know if it applies to everyone or just to him, but it's still pretty useful to just keep the bleed on the enemy once you already have it, so you can get a bunch of extra damage over the course of the rest of the fight. So, the damage of this class, if you do have bleed, isn't terrible. It's still not as good as a lot of other classes, and the art cooldowns in many situations aren't going to be as favorable either, but it's at least something. Unfortunately, Rapid Shot's just kind of a slow attack in general. I don't know why they have such long wind-up time, but you can still do some decent damage with that. The Talon Art is okay. I don't really think it's that amazing, sadly, but it's something at the very least. I go ahead and try to reapply bleed before going into the chain attack here. And now we can just kind of see how much damage we can hit in a chain attack with this class. When everything is stacked up, we get power charge and we just do everything properly. So, standard starting off, I'm just going to quickly attack. And this is a standard chain attack with Astra, where you just try to pick her order as soon as you have it. Now, since I'm running a SIG, I already have power charge on everyone, but Astra would grant that if I didn't. And she also gives a guaranteed amazing and then another 200% damage ratio on top of that, so that's always very helpful. Now, this thing isn't the tankiest, so it shouldn't really take that long to kill. I won't be able to show off the really funny damage number until afterwards. But this class does get an extra 70% damage when the enemy's under 30% health, which does also apply in chain attacks. So the class can actually start hitting some decent damage numbers at this point in time. That crit there did over 2 million. And we haven't even lowered enemy ether defense with Uni yet, so we're finally hitting some respectable damage numbers. Unfortunately, though, the enemy is not under 30% health very much in the fight, and once you actually get into a chain attack, it's usually not that hard to kill enemies, especially on normal mode. It would probably be a bit more useful on hard mode, where enemies have more health and chain attacks are just nerfed to basically half damage. But on hard mode, you probably would be very, very unlikely to inflict bleed, which would make this much harder as a strategy. Speaking of bleed, the bleed has worn off, so I need to reapply it here, which is what I'm going to be using this round for. I'll be using Noah's 2 bleed arts to try to reapply that. Starting off with Uni so I can get some extra ratio with Noah when I finally use him. Cyan gets the tactical point meter all the way to 99, and Noah should hopefully get us over 200. So I apply the bleed. The bleed is actually successfully applied, and we get our amazing. And next round, I'm going to try to use the Uni. I also get Noah back, which was nice. Uni will finally lower the ether defense of the enemy, so I'll be able to hit even higher damage numbers finally after this turn. Though I'm able to do some respectable damage on this turn as well. I don't have power charge currently, but Mia will give that to me next round. But even without power charge, this should do some pretty nice damage. Over 2 million with that one hit as well. And the ether defense is finally being lowered, and I'll have power charge next turn, so we can finally hit something really, really nice next turn. Damage ratio is at 1249. Or the extra, what the damage is being multiplied by, so that's pretty good. I'll use Mio to grant power charge and an attack up to everyone, and I'll just use Noah to finish this off here, even though the enemy's been dead a long time already. We can hit over almost 5 million with that one attack, and over 1 million with the non-crit on the other attack. So nothing astounding even after all of that setup and all of that hype, but it's something at least, and shows the class can be successful in the right situations. But that bleed is really, really important, so that's definitely something you really, really need to have as much as you can. So I don't really know if there's really that much more to show off about this class. It's really just very reliant on bleed. The arts are kind of slow, so I think I might end this off right here just after that one fight. And hopefully that was enough to teach you about how to use the class properly. Now, typically you want to make sure you're like dashing behind enemies as much as you can to get the bleed, and then dashing to the side afterwards to get your rapid shut off if you're running that art. And using the launch art, using your art that does extra damage to launch enemies can be useful on the launch art. Make sure you power charge before your most powerful attack. It's a pretty simple class to use overall. I just wish it was a bit more useful and a bit stronger. I feel like it gets gutted really hard by enemies having debuff resistance. Maybe if enemies couldn't resist the bleed effect that Stalker specifically have, it would be a lot more useful. But I think just debuffs need kind of an overhaul in general, because right now they're just not very good, sadly. I hope you guys did learn something from watching this video, and if you did, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, comment down below, and please look forward to the remaining class guides and a couple other things I have planned. I know I haven't been too active in the last few days, but I'm going to be back at it pretty soon. Things have been pretty busy for me recently, but I am going to finish the schedule that I have laid out, so please look forward to everything that I have planned. With all that being said, thank you guys so much for watching, and have a wonderful and blessed day.